Welcome, everybody. We're just waiting for more people to join the webinar, and then we'll start shortly. Welcome, everybody. We're just waiting for more people to join the webinar, and then we'll start shortly. We'll start in about 1 minute. Good morning, afternoon, and evening, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to yet another Academy of International Business, Journal of International Business, Journal of International Business Policy webinar series. We're doing something a little bit different in this webinar. Given the recent passing of Oliver Williamson, we decided that we thought that it would be important to do a bit of a retrospective and a look at the influence that Oliver Williamson has had on international business and international scholarship. While Oliver himself, was not an individual publishing in the IB journals very much, his work really has had profound influence on the field over the last 30 plus years. And this webinar is meant to provide some perspective from a number of different scholars about the nature and depth and breadth of that influence. My name's Timothy Deviney. I am one of the co-organizers of the webinar series, along with Klaus Meyer. We have 4 speakers, Alain Verbeke, Jean-Francois Hennart, David Teece, and Joanne Oxley, in that order. And the moderator for today's session is going to be Peter Klein. All have had their own interactions with Oliver over the years, and each of them is going to provide a unique and different perspective. So with that as a bit of an introduction, what I'd like to do is hand over to Peter to begin the proceedings. So Peter, over to you.
Thanks very much, Tim. It's a great pleasure to participate in this webinar to discuss the influence of Oliver Williamson on the field of international business. Williamson, of course, was the 2009 or one of the 2009 Nobel laureates in economics and the founder of the so-called transaction cost perspective to economic organization. In my mind, Williamson is one of the great social scientists of the late 20th century. As Tim mentioned, Williamson passed away this past May at the age of 87. I knew him quite well. He was my dissertation advisor, as well as Joanne's, and he was a close colleague of David, both at Penn and at Berkeley, and has had an influence on all of our participants today, as well as the field of international business more generally. You know, Williamson was a very original thinker. He was trained at Carnegie Mellon by Herbert Simon, Jim March, and Dick Seyert, and was part of a very interdisciplinary, creative, and kind of heterodox community. And I think that way of thinking had a huge influence on Williamson. His dissertation dealt with the problem of managerial discretion, what we would later describe in the language of agency theory. It was published in book form in 1963 and was extremely influential in sort of opening up the black box of the business firm and thinking about it more from an individual and managerialist perspective. Oliver spent a couple of years at Berkeley before moving to University of Pennsylvania, and he had has a great story by his own account. He was asked to teach a course in industrial organization, a field in which he had no formal training as a student or as a faculty member. So he sort of created his own industrial organization course from scratch. So he wasn't bound by the traditional ways of thinking on that topic. Maybe some of you have been in that same situation. A few years later, in the late 1960s, he served as a special assistant to Richard Turner, who was head of the US Justice Department's Antitrust Division. And Oliver became convinced through his work at the Justice Department that the mainstream theories of the firm, those that were dominant at that time, were overly simplistic and really were not well suited to capture the broad diversity of organizational and business practices that firms were using. Actual firms did not look like the firms of economics textbooks and even advanced economic models. And while most people saw this as evidence that firms were doing something wrong, Oliver saw it as evidence that the theories were in fact deficient. And it was thinking about these kinds of problems that led to his breakthrough analysis of organizations, particularly as represented by his most famous book, his 1975 book, Markets and Hierarchies, which according to my, as of last night, had 44,346 citations, according to Google Scholar, which is a lot even for Tim Deviney. Williamson also in the 70s began developing his distinct approach to vertical integration, published really for the first time in a 1979 article in the Journal of Law and Economics. This article introduced the transaction cost approach to vertical integration, in which the choice between in-house production or external procurement is explained by characteristics of the underlying transactions, especially the characteristic of asset specificity, as Williamson called it. Asset specificity refers to resources that are more valuable in their current uses and to their current users than they would be in the next best alternative use. And as Williamson and other scholars as well showed, assets that are high in this kind of specificity can lead to some sort of contractual or organizational hazards when they're involved in exchange. And firms and trading partners have to figure out how to govern their transactions to mitigate these problems. Maybe Williamson's easiest to read book is his 85 work called The Economic Institutions of Capitalism, which is also extremely well known, where he elaborates this and develops this framework further, focusing on the choice between, or the advantages and disadvantages of markets, hierarchies, and hybrids. And this is really one of the most influential works in the field of economic organization, business administration, and industrial organization as well. Transaction costs are really central to our analysis of firms and contracts and organizations, and making the transaction, rather than the firm or the country or the person, the unit of analysis has been extremely fruitful. As I mentioned before, Williamson's contributions to economics, especially IO and antitrust, were recognized by the Nobel Committee. But his influence today might be even greater in strategic management, organization theory, entrepreneurship, public administration, law, and of course, international business. I should add that in terms of his career, after many years at Penn and then a brief stint at Yale Law School, Oliver returned to Berkeley in 1988, where he remained for the rest of his career. And there he became a very influential mentor and teacher. He advised a great number of PhD students, including myself and Joanne, and many of these students have gone on to be influential in economics and management and other disciplines. Oliver saw transaction cost economics as very general. He liked to say that any problem that can be expressed in terms of comparative economic organization can also be usefully explained in transaction cost economizing terms. In other words, transaction cost thinking is not only about a mundane topic like vertical integration, but is much broader and applies to many facets of economic and commercial life. And of course, today we're here to discuss the implications of the transaction cost framework to international business. And it's a great pleasure to have these four distinguished speakers, all of whom, of course, are influential in the IB field, but all of whom have been influenced in different ways by Williamson's work. So I'm just going to turn it over to each speaker one at a time in the order that was described by Tim. And let me remind the participants that we do have time for Q&A and discussion, but that will be after each presenter gives a series of brief remarks. Presenters, let me remind you on behalf of Tim Deviney, you have 10 minutes, 10 and only 10 minutes to give your prepared remarks. And we do have the power of the mute button in case you wander too far over your allotted time. And so for the participants, if you could, as you think of questions, if you could please type them into the Q&A window. Once the formal presentations are over, I will then read out the questions that have been put in the Q&A window to some or all participants and ask them to respond. So again, please don't use the chat feature to ask your questions for the panelists. Please use the Q&A window instead. So without further ado, let me turn it over first to Alain Verbeke, whom you all know. He is at the University of Calgary and is editor of Jibs and one of the most influential figures in the IB field. So Alain, please take it away.
Dear colleagues, it is a privilege to share with you a few thoughts on Oliver Williamson's impact on the field of international business, whereby I will focus especially on the insights that his work provides for future research endeavors. But allow me to start with a personal memory. The day after I first arrived in Canada in September 1986 to do postdoctoral work with the late Alan Rugman at Dalhousie University in Halifax, Alan came to my office and gave me two books. The first was the just published Competition in Global Industries, edited by Michael Porter, and the second was The Economic Institutions of Capitalism, published the year before. Alan instructed me to start my postdoc with reading these two books and to report back to him about these. The Porter book took about 4 days to read and included many enjoyable ideas from high-profile contributors on the real world of international strategic management. I subsequently taught it as a textbook at Dalhousie, and it went over well with the MBA students. The Economic Institutions of Capitalism was very different. It took me more than 2 weeks to complete the reading. I had never read a business book that was so precise in the language used and so sophisticated in the essence of governance. Almost 15 years later, after moving to Calgary, I was given the opportunity to teach a PhD course on conceptual frameworks of the enterprise. For the core reading, I was hesitating between the 1985 book and the then much more recent 1996 one, Mechanisms of Governance. I asked Williamson which book he would choose. He strongly recommended the 1985 one because it had been written with a student in mind. But I did not follow his advice and selected the 1996 book, which is an extraordinary erudite expose on the intricacies of governance and which competently addresses many of the main criticisms of transaction cost theory. I have now taught this book for almost 20 years, not because I'm lazy, but because PhD students are unlikely to be exposed to something so uniquely integrative and filled with actionable insights elsewhere in their course program. This brings me to the future of IB research and how it can use Williamsonian thinking to inform this work. I should mention that modern internalization theory, which has a few different streams and was a subject of a recent JIP special issue, is closely aligned with Williamsonian thinking, and I would encourage any IB scholar to read the excellent introduction to the special issue, as well as some of the superb essays in the special issue, including the closing piece. Let me then briefly make 5 points. First, the comparative institutional analysis of real-world alternatives. It seems so self-evident as bordering on the trivial. However, as editor-in-chief of JIPS, I see far too many manuscripts that do not apply this simple frame of mind and prescribe what firms should be doing following supposedly best practices or outcomes of some statistical or other analysis. As one example, much of the literature that addresses supposed linkages between dimensions of internationalization and performance at a fundamental level neglects the need for comparative institutional analysis and comes up with prescriptions that are often plain wrong. Doing some tests on endogeneity will not solve the problem. And as IB scholars are now increasingly becoming interested in addressing grand challenges, especially related to environmental and social causes, Williamsonian thinking cautions all of us not to equate wishful thinking with what is feasible in the world of commerce. Second, Williamson focused on asset specificity, whereas many IB scholars typically attach more importance to firm-specific advantages, or FSAs, for example, intermediate outputs such as patents and brand names, or any other resource bundles, some being higher order ones, that need to be safeguarded when selecting governance structures in foreign markets. But we are largely talking about the same thing. And here again, we have somewhat of a problem with much contemporary work in IB, conducted on subject matters such as global value chain ecosystems and digital globalization. To a large extent, the opportunities to create value are overemphasized, whereas the dangers of losing control over proprietary FSAs are somewhat underestimated, to put it mildly. We talk a lot in IB about recombining resources in novel ways in foreign markets, but to a large extent, this is equivalent to Williamson's far-sighted contracting. I think that there must be a renewed focus in IB research on the challenges of far-sighted contracting to protect FSAs in international operations, especially when studying these new business models. This brings me to my third point, which may also be addressed by our friend Jean-Francois Hennart. Transaction cost theory has, of course, always been about value creation and capture through good governance. But many junior colleagues think that transaction cost theory has nothing to do with value creation or innovation. In my view, IB scholars should precisely focus on selecting those governance alternatives that will reduce bounded rationality and unreliability and establish an organizational context for value creation in its entirety. Proper cross-border governance is the key challenge most senior management teams and owners of internationally operating firms are concerned with, and it is where we can make a difference when informing practitioners. My fourth point is that Williamson has often been misunderstood in terms of the relative importance he attached to formal versus relational contracting. Much work, as we have heard, he conducted did address formal contracting, such as vertical integration and antitrust issues, simply because at the time, many important empirical questions revolved around formal contracting. But it should be clear that careful analysis of ex-post governance, almost by definition, has much to do with relational contracting, because it is about working things out. I would even like to go one step further and make a very bold statement. Our friend David Teece will likely talk about dynamic capabilities. Well, to a large extent, dynamic capabilities can be interpreted as the superior capacity to adapt through and as a result of a large number of micro-level, formal and relational contracts. And from the perspective of requisite selectivity, the challenge is to identify those contracts that matter most and therefore deserve most managerial attention. Finally, in international transactions, it is clear that opportunism, or rather the danger of it materializing, constitutes a major governance challenge with possible cascading effects between the macro level and the micro level, thereby affecting value creation and capture. Much IB literature over the past decades has investigated how internationally operating firms must respond to opportunism abroad. I recently co-authored an article in the Journal of Management Studies that addresses configurational patterns of opportunism. However, many real-world IB cases also highlight the importance of unreliability that is not driven by strong form self-interest, but rather by other behavioral drivers, especially benevolent preference reversals and identity-based discordances, for instance, in the sphere of national cultural differences. In this context, a number of IB scholars rely on a concept that Williamson was deeply skeptical about, namely trust, which he viewed as a concept devoid of merit. Trust implies vulnerability, unsupported by credible safeguards, which is unwise in all circumstances where critical and difficult to protect assets are involved. Once safeguards are introduced, including experience-based and reputational ones, there is no more need to invoke the concept of trust. Therefore, ask not, how do I craft trusting relationships with foreign partners, but rather ask, how do the requisite safeguards change when I cross borders, especially inter-regional borders? Irrespective of one's views on the merits of opportunism, trust, or bounded reliability, in terms of future IB research, we do need to attach more importance upfront in our work, upfront to realistic micro foundations, including, for instance, analysis of digital firms that are internationalizing, or studies of smaller partners in global value chain ecosystems that are trying to move up the supposedly smiling curve. To conclude, much of the best work in IB builds upon intellectual foundations aligned with Williamsonian thinking. This thinking interfaces easily with the practice of management. My main message to IB scholars, and especially junior people, is to remember the following guideline from Professor Oliver Williamson. And this is a quote: "The world of commerce is recognized in favor of the cynics as against the innocents when social scientists employ user-friendly language that is not descriptively accurate, since only the innocents are taken in." Thank you.
Alain, thank you very much for those insightful remarks. I'm going to turn it over next to Jean-Francois Hennart, and you have some slides to share, so we'll give you a second to get those set up.
Okay.
You can share your screen now.
Oops. Okay. So can you hear me?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. Very good. So thank you very much, Tim, for organizing the seminar, and thank you, Peter, for managing it. I just want to make, my original goal was to make 3 points. I think I will only make 2, given the time limit. The first point is that I wanted to recall a bit, I came into contact with transaction cost theory. And the second point is I wanted to talk about how transaction cost theory can and should be adjusted to fit better international business. So basically, I started my PhD, writing my PhD thesis in 1973. And my original goal was to come up with some evaluation of the economic impact of multinational firms in host countries. This was a PhD thesis in economics at University of Maryland. Mansur Olson was my advisor. But I found out very quickly that there was actually no theory, no economic theory of the firm as an institution. So I started to look around, read around, and 2 years later, after having read a lot of agency theory and property rights theory, I came up with a draft of a model of why firms can succeed compared to markets and why markets fail. But then I came up into Williamson's 1975 book, and I was extremely encouraged that actually this was very consistent with some of the stuff I had written, but of course there was a lot more I could borrow. So I came up with a comprehensive model that merged agency theory, property rights theory, and transaction cost theory. The thesis was defended in 1977 and finally published in 1982 as a theory of multinational enterprise. Out of the experience of doing that, I came to, because my goal was actually to look at multinational firms, I came to understand better how transaction cost theory actually could fit better international business. And the first point, which I think should be done, let me see here. Oops. Hold on just 1 minute. I'll move to the next one. The first point that should be done is what I call the case of missing multinationals. And the idea is that in international business, it's very clear that market failure is not a sufficient condition for the existence of multinational firms. Markets can fail, but firms can fail as well. If both fails, you've got other solutions to the problem of interdependence, to the organization of interdependence. And interesting case is what I call here the case of the missing multinationals. If you looked at the British, the UK in the last quarter of the 18th century and the first half of the 19th century was just as ahead of the rest of the world as the US might have been starting in the 1900s and certainly after 1950. But in the case of the US, most knowledge was actually transferred to other countries through foreign direct investment. In the case of the British technological innovation, they were not transferred through multinational investment. In fact, multinational enterprise do not start till the 1860s. Before that, the transfer took very different forms. One of the forms that it took was basically theft. And there is a very funny story about Leven Bouwens, who was a Belgian, a Ghent entrepreneur, who actually got hired by a British factory and then smuggled parts and design of the mule jenny and started Ghent as the second Manchester in cotton by basically going back to Ghent and starting business there. The other way in which knowledge was transferred was with immigrant entrepreneurs who left England and who settled in Europe, very often with the encouragement of national governments. For example, an interesting example is William Cockrell, who went to Belgium near Liège and basically started a factory with the support of the King of the Netherlands. At that time, Belgium was part of the Netherlands, and later on with the support of the King of Belgium. So the point here is that if you do international, especially if you do international business, you should always be aware that market failure is not enough. You must also think in terms of the efficiency, the possible efficiency or inefficiency of organizations. And from that point of view, a lot of people have interpreted Williamson as in terms of the three conditions that Williamson talks about, which is asset specificity, which is uncertainty and frequency. But clearly, those are conditions which explain why markets fail. They are not conditions which explain why firms may succeed. And again, market failure and firm success are actually not the same thing. The third point that I would like to make is entitled The Specificity of Asset Specificity. And I think people interpret Williamson very often in a very literal way, and they think that asset specificity is the end-all and be-all of transaction cost theory. Asset specificity is one case of ex-post small number conditions, but there are many cases of ex-ante small number conditions, and other cases as well of ex-post small number conditions. If you think in terms of things such as network externalities, they are basically also a type of ex-post small number conditions. If you think in terms of scale economies lead to natural monopolies. Monopolies are a case of ex-ante small number conditions. And of course, you have also the case that governments very often intervene to become monopolistic buyers and sellers of products, goods and services, in which case you also have small number conditions. The other point that I would like to make is about a point that actually Alain actually stressed, and it's the fact that, in fact, transaction cost theory to some extent is misnamed. It should not be called transaction cost theory. It should be called about value maximizing theory, because the essence of the theory is to choose the governance institution that actually maximizes the rents available to the parties from organizing their transaction. So if you think about the benefits of organizing transactions, which can be scale economies, where more than one person must collaborate to create value, or which can sometimes be a comparative advantage, where people with different skills cooperate to create value. The goal, of course, is not to minimize the cost of doing the transaction. The goal is to maximize the benefits of organizing those individuals, to maximize the gain that those individuals can achieve through their interaction. And one very clear example of that, which shows that the idea that transaction cost theory is about minimizing cost, comes from looking at the organization modes which are chosen to incentivize salespeople. Now, you can either pay salespeople a straight salary, or you can pay them commission. Commission, of course, involves setting up rules. It involves tracing up sales to particular salespeople. It also involves dealing with conflicts. And this, of course, means higher transaction costs. But why do some firms actually use commissioned salespeople as opposed to straight salary? Because the increase in sales that results from commission payment is a lot higher and more than makes up for the additional cost of using transactions. So I think I must be just about out of time, and I won't have time to talk about some of the other points, but maybe we can address them later.
Terrific. Thank you very much for that presentation. Can you unshare your screen, please? Yes, wonderful. Yes. Thank you. Okay, so we're going to turn it over next to David Teece. David, please take it away. Oh, David, you need to unmute. You're still muted. Yeah, we still can't hear you. Look for your mute button at the bottom.
I got it. Can you hear me now?
Perfect.
Okay. Well, I think we should all recognize that this is the only Nobel laureate that the Academy of International Business is probably likely to pay a tribute to. And as Peter pointed out, this is reflective of the fact that Williamson really had broad scope to what he was working on. And I'd like to say that in part, he got interested in international business because as a graduate student at Penn, I was studying international economics as well as industrial organization, and insisted that Williamson deal with some of the issues in international business, and he eventually did, to our mutual benefit. I think to calibrate his impact, one has to actually think about where the field of international business was and where the field of international economics was, for that matter, in the mid 70s at the time that Markets and Hierarchies was published. And there was really no theory of the firm that was having much impact. And international business didn't really have much to it in the way of underlying theoretical substance at all. But at about that time, in 75, of course, you had the publication of the work by Berkeley and Casson, which was very, very Coasean. But the competition, if you will, the rivalry, or the main ideas in the field of international business were Ray Vernon's work from Harvard around multinationals. And he very much had a theory of direct investment driven off the product life cycle, which was an important insight, but didn't really go to the fundamentals of why this should be done inside the firm versus contractually or in some other fashion. And then there was another writer out there, very significant for the limited amount of time that he was involved in international business, and that was Stephen Heimer. And you really had two implicitly competitive views of the world. There was Heimer, who in some sense was aligned with the old industrial organization school that looked for a monopoly to explain everything. And his view of the multinational corporation was that, well, this is really about extracting rents from the third world and from elsewhere. And that's what foreign investment was animated by. But at this time, you had competing theories that was coming from Berkeley and Casson, implicitly from Coase. And what Williamson did was give impetus to those efficiency-based views of the world. So he really wasn't the first to sort of bring a transactions cost theory of international business forward. Actually, Peter Berkeley and was there with Mike Casson. But what Williamson did was, I think, give true substance to it. And that's why he's been so influential. Now, you might just reflect for a moment about how influential this has been, not just on thinking in the field of international business, but also on public policy. The previous theories, the Heimer theories and to a limited extent, the Vernon theories, really had this very unfriendly view of what foreign investment was about. And, that fueled protectionism and resistance to foreign investment. The rest of us in the field of international business today is well aware of how the multinational enterprises have become an instrument of technology transfer and bringing, ideas and capabilities to the rest of the world. But there was this enormous hostility, which actually stood in the way of economic development for many, many years. And Williamson, I think, and implicitly along with Coase, sort of helped lead to a sea change and led one to see the international firms and international business and multinational firms as actually being contributing not just to profitability and efficiency of firms, but actually to economic development. So in that sense, Williamson has been tremendously influential. I do want to, though, point out that Williamson had, and I think Peter underscored this, a very analytical approach, and he really brought rigor to looking at firms. And his view was that you should make a theory as simple as possible and use it to explain as much as possible. And in a way, while it's true that there's a lot more in Williamson than asset specificity, he was quite explicit that the big horse, as I think he used it, he described it actually in his Nobel laureate, the big locomotive is what he called it in his Nobel speech, is asset specificity. And asset specificity, more than anything else, was used to explain vertical integration, which then in turn led to explaining why companies would integrate by going upstream. And indeed, you could explain the actions and the activities and investment patterns extraction companies, particularly oil and gas companies, using a Williamsonian framework. But because he was a bit less eager to sort of look at innovation questions, I don't think he took it as far as he could have in terms of explaining the horizontal expansion of international firms. And at the same time, though, or should I say, but at the same time, Williamson was the first one to recognize that innovation complicates the world a lot and complicates his theories a lot, or at least the theoretical platform upon which scholars such as ourselves has to operate. And I've actually been reviewing his work recently because I'm just finished a tribute on Williamson's impact on antitrust. And I discovered quite a number of places where Oliver was both recognizing the importance of innovation, recognizing the importance of capabilities, but more or less saying he's not going to bring that into the theory right now because it complicates things too much. So I think, in a way, one should think of Williamson's contribution at the same time as one thinks of Ronald Coase's contribution. That Williamson built on Coase. Coase put internalization theory up there, and scholars in the field of international business simultaneously employed sort of a Coase-Williamson framework to explain a lot of complex forms of business behavior. Coase, of course, never once bothered to address head-on the issues that international business scholars address, but Williamson did. He wrote about relational contracting, he wrote about joint ventures, he wrote about strategic alliances, and I think Joanne and other students at Berkeley were part of the process of luring Williamson onto these issues, as I had done as a graduate student 10 years earlier. And so I think we have a rich feast of thinking and ideas and concepts that are going to stay in the field of international business for a very long time. But at the same time, we have to find clever ways of integrating the innovation perspective as well as a capabilities perspective to really understand a lot of the rich phenomena that you see today. And with all of the issues between the United States and China, of course, we're reminded how political economy can affect global supply chains. So I think the great thing about Oliver Williamson is that he was a social scientist. I'm with Peter in actually believing that Markets and Hierarchies is a much richer book to read than Economic Institutions of Capitalism. Economic Institutions of Capitalism is a much cleaner and more elegant expose of how transactions cost thinking can impact organizational design. And it was written, I think very much to show the elegance of the framework. And I think that's kind of what got him the Nobel Prize at the end of the day. But a lot of the richness that comes from the Carnegie tradition is actually in the 1975 book, Markets and Hierarchies. And the good news is there's plenty of room in the Williamsonian framework to blend in other ideas and to find complementary ways of augmenting the power of transactions cost economics as one looks at complex business behavior. So I'll simply leave it at that to say that we're all great beneficiaries of the fact that one, he had a framework that was useful to international business and that many of us on this webinar here were part of a process of getting him focused on complex forms of behavior that you saw in international business. And the combination of that means that there's a rich legacy of concepts, ideas, and empirical work that's been stimulated by his, I think, powerful contributions.
David, thank you very much for those remarks. We've been saving the best for last. So Joanne, let me turn it over to you for the final set of prepared remarks.
Yeah, thank you so much. And actually, thank you to Alain and Jean-Francois and David. I think you've really done a great job of kind of both positioning and explicating really Williamson's contributions to IB, and I applaud that, and I won't just repeat that. Let me though just say a few words about Williamson as a teacher and a mentor, and basically just say how incredibly lucky I was to be at Berkeley at the time that I was. I mean, Williamson always talked about the luck and the importance of the environment that he found himself in at Carnegie, and how that really shaped him and a whole research agenda. I feel equally lucky to have been at Berkeley in the early 90s. You know, I started my PhD in 1989, and I was an MBA student for a couple of years before that. And that really was, for PhD students in particular, I think such a golden age at Berkeley. And in terms of the timing, you know, speaking to particularly David, your comments about, you know, Williamson's evolving interest here, I think part of what made that such an incredibly special environment for me in particular is that, you know, that kind of late 80s, early 90s was exactly when Williamson really was becoming interested in sources of contracting hazards beyond asset specificity, kind of beginning to really think that it was the right time for expanding that purview. And of course, in no small part due to your work. It was also when his interest in hybrids was really peaking. His interest in kind of international and institutional variety, I think, was also very much on his mind at that time. And thank goodness it also coincided with the time in his career when he became interested in PhD training, I think in part, to be honest, because he thought that the theory was sufficiently well explicated that it was now time to pass it on and have other people kind of go out and proselytize on his behalf in some sense. And I think that, you know, as I say, I feel very fortunate to be a part of that. And particularly with respect to, you know, international business, I think some of the, you know, the people that, obviously I was one of the people who was particularly interested in that set of phenomena of his students, but I was also put Veit Hennisch in that brigade, and also Brian Silverman. And I should say that in addition to us being lucky that this was the time when Oliver was becoming very interested in PhD training, it was also a time when we had David Teece there and David Mowry there, who were very kind of complementary as well to for students who were trained clearly deeply in social science, but also had aspirations to work in business schools, which wasn't always, let's just say it wasn't always Oliver's forte to talk to kind of MBA students and speaking to that more applied management literature. So it was important for us that we also had other mentors available who could you know, kind of point us in the right direction in that way. In terms of the, you know, relationship with IB research and contributions, as I say, I don't want to repeat what's been said, but I think just want to highlight a couple of points that have already been made. One is, you know, just how strongly the ideas that we students learned through Oliver's teaching, how strongly those ideas resonated, obviously, with internalization theory and other ideas within the IB literature. I must admit, when I first came across the IB literature, I was surprised at how that kind of long history of similar kind of Coasian development of ideas. And in some ways, there's a sense of some independent invention, if you like, going along. I think to a large extent, Williamson was not paying a lot of attention to the international business literature as it was going along, even though, as I say, a lot of those ideas really resonated. And in that sense, I think in some ways, the biggest contribution that Williamson made to IB is precisely this, what's been mentioned, that focus on the transaction as the unit of analysis, which created a great deal of kind of discipline. And then perhaps even more so, this like relentless comparative analysis, right? It was he would speak about this as being, you have to be relentlessly comparative. And I think that, if anything, is the thing that I've seen in terms of the biggest change in the kind of the leading edge research within the international business community, that to me is probably one of the biggest contributions. The last, I don't want to take much time because I want to leave time here for Q&A, but I will say I do also just want to kind of give a little bit of a shout out as well to Williamson's influence, not just through his first generation of students, such as, like me and Reed and Brian, but really onto the next generation as well. If you'll start looking at who are the students of his students, you come up with people like Juan Alcázar. Now, I wasn't Juan's dissertation advisor, but I was on his committee, and then Nanjia, Alina Kolchina. These are all students who are very active and I think contribute significantly to the IB community, and I think have just kind of taken on and have maybe combined transaction cost thinking with other perspectives as well, but definitely carry on that tradition. And so I think that is something that I know he was proud of, and that gave him satisfaction. Just one little anecdote. I was once at a conference where Williamson was there and Nanjia was there, who was my student. And in fact, Nan and Williamson were on the same panel. And afterwards, I introduced them, and Oliver's face lit up, and he went, "Oh, my academic grandchild!" And of course that also made Nan's day. And I know that really was something that, particularly in the latter part of his career, he took a huge interest in his students, and we were incredible beneficiaries of demanding, but great, careful and caring, and huge investments in his students. So I think I'll leave it there and leave some time for Q&A.
Okay, terrific. Thanks, Joanne. That was really great. And again, thank you to all four of the presenters for very stimulating and quite complimentary reflections on Williamson's influence. We do have a lot of action in the Q&A window. Again, if you're just joining us late, if you do have a question, please type it into the Q&A window, and I will repeat those questions to the panelists. And I've been reading through them and enjoying the questions. I'm going to bounce around a little bit and maybe try to start with the more general questions, and then depending on how much time we have, move to some of the more specific ones. I'd like to start with a question posed by Irina a little while ago. Williamson emphasized being very careful and focusing on looking at details, looking at specific mechanisms rather than trying to overgeneralize to explain particular phenomena. Even the way he did research, right? He emphasized and urged his students to do research that was, as he called it, modest, slow, molecular, and definitive, rather than a lot of armchair theorizing. So given Williamson's emphasis on looking at specific mechanisms, is there any tension between that approach and the emphasis one often finds in international business of working at a higher level of generality, trying to explain general theories and sort of big picture phenomena? Does anyone have a comment on this possible tension between an emphasis on small mechanisms, specific mechanisms, and broad theorizing?
Yeah, Peter, I'll have a shot at that. Can you hear me? Yeah, I think Williamson sort of in a way did both. I mean, what broader topic could you have than the economic institutions of capitalism, which was the title of his book? But at the same time, you're dead right that he always required you to focus on what he called the microanalytics and get close to the facts. And this is what makes him, as a Nobel laureate in economics, useful to people in international business, because we're interested in both levels. And that's why he could be impactful on antitrust, and why he could use the lens of transaction cost economics to inform vertical mergers and at this firm specific level. So yes, he would insist on focusing at the microanalytic level. But if you look at what he actually did himself, he didn't focus much there. That's where he wanted his graduate students to focus. He was focused at a grand level of explaining nothing less than the economic institutions of a market economy.
Yeah, David, at the same time, do you think some of his antitrust work, for example, criticizing some of the existing grand theories on the grounds that they leave out some critical details, as in the way people approach vertical integration, are there some cautions, some Williamsonian lessons that have not been fully absorbed in the IB field?
Yes, I think so. That he was very much critical of folks in the antitrust field who would run for a monopoly explanation for everything. He said, if you dig deeper, if you dig into the microanalytics, you ask the question, what's going on here? That was another Williamsonian phrase, which of course at one level is banal. Everybody should be asking that question. But the fact that you had to insist on it tells you how far out on the theory limb so many people were. So asking what's going on here led to a different theory of vertical integration. And now, I mean, yesterday up on the Hill, we have this big debate about big tech and antitrust. There's no person's work is more relevant to that than Oliver Williamson's. And that's what I've been writing about. And you're about to see an industrial and corporate change and effort on my part to take the Williamson's framework and use it to inform some of the questions around mergers and acquisitions and the role of big tech and antitrust. So he really played both ends of the game. It's the macro or aggregate level that won him the Nobel Prize, but it's the micro level that made him a hero in the field of international business.
Thank you. Any other panelists want to jump in on that topic?
Yeah, I'll jump in if it's possible. It's actually a very interesting way in which the macro analysis leads to macro conclusions. And that is when you look at the literature in IB about multinationality and performance. Now, in transaction cost theory, in optimally, each transaction, each institution is matched to the characteristics of the transaction. So for every single transaction, the manager matches the transaction characteristic to governance structure. One of that governance structure has implication for the footprint of the firm, because if the multinational integrates into foreign plants, the footprint increases. So when you think about, on a transaction cost term, about the relationship between multinationality and performance, it is not U-shape, inverse U-shape, W-shape, inverted W-shape, as hundreds of articles in international business. It's actually no relationship except a relationship of fit. In other words, when you look at the footprint of the firm, it is the sum of all transactions which have chosen a particular governance structure and hence have implication for a particular footprint. And therefore, the only relationship between multinationality and performance is one of fit. If you are unfit, that is, if you choose the wrong governance structure, you will have lower performance, whether it's too much vertical integration or too little. And this is a very important implication of transaction cost theory that shows very well that a microanalysis basically ends up in macro phenomenon, and transaction cost theory is very, very useful in explaining those macro phenomenon based on a very careful analysis of micro phenomenon. It's also explained, by the way, why, and this is a surprise in some parts of the IB literature, why the same firm can use different modes of entry in the same, across countries, of course, but also in the same country for different types of customers. And that is because different types of customers, it's a different transaction. If you sell, for example, like Dell did to large multinationals, foreign multinationals on the coast of China, you basically can sell through salespeople, for your own salespeople. But if you sell to the inland, to Chinese firm in the inland of China, then you need to use distributors. So the same product sold with different modes because of different customers. And I think this is a very important understanding that you have when you study transaction cost theory, which seems to be not understood by a lot of people in IB.
Okay, wonderful. Let's continue in this vein of thinking about some big picture issues. I'm going to combine a question from Gabrielle with one from Christopher. Gabrielle asks us to compare three particular theories: transaction cost economics, a la Williamson, internalization theory, and what he calls the Hennartian approach. So Jean-Francois, we'll let you jump in first since you're one of the principals here. Christopher also asks about comparing TCE to theories about power dependency, sort of institutional theory and so forth. So I guess the question for anyone, but we'll let Jean-Francois go first, are these three or four alternative approaches, are they proposing different answers to the same phenomena? Are they rivals, or are they complementary theories that address different aspects, different phenomena or different aspects of phenomena, or are they making the same kinds of arguments just in different language?
Okay, so I think that the difference, I think, between transaction cost theory and my Williamson transaction cost theory and my approach, I mean, I don't have time to go and explain in detail because I think that would take too much time. But one, I think, very important emphasis is that when you looked at foreign direct investment from an IB perspective, foreign direct investment has to do to large, there is vertical integration in which asset specificity is very useful, but it's also a lot of horizontal investment. And horizontal investments are basically not so much driven by asset specificity, they are driven much more by information asymmetry and property rights. So if you think, for example, at the exchange of knowledge, the exchange of knowledge is subject to Arrow's paradox, which is that the buyer, by definition, doesn't know what he or she is buying, because, of course, the knowledge is, if he wants to buy knowledge, he doesn't have the knowledge. So the answer to that, of course, is the patent system in which knowledge can be made public, therefore reducing information asymmetry, while keeping property rights for the owner of the knowledge and preventing, therefore, so the owner of the knowledge can make the knowledge public, but not lose the knowledge, as it would happen if there were no property rights in knowledge. So this, I think, when you looked at international business, information asymmetry, or what Williamson has called the measurement cost theory aspect of transaction cost theory, the work of Basel, the work of Alschen, the work of Demsetz, becomes much more important. So that's, I think, one aspect. That, I think, is perfectly compatible with internalization theory, but it is a bit of an extension from property rights, from Williamsonian transaction cost theory. And you see a lot of people in IB trying to stretch asset specificity to explain horizontal investment, which I think is a complex way to explain something much more simpler. Also, it also, I think, puts a lot of focus on property rights, which I think maybe Williamson does not put, to my view, maybe doesn't put enough focus in, which are, of course, very crucial in the international business context.
Yeah, let me, Peter, if I may, add a little bit to that. It is confusing that there are different definitions of transactions costs out there. In finance, for instance, the bid-ask spread is sort of close to what a transactions cost is. In COS, there's a lot more emphasis on the costs of negotiating and enforcing contracts. Williamson, I think, did add a little bit of clarity to what was critical in terms of transaction costs, but that's by focusing on asset specificity. But in a way, he was really thinking about governance costs. I mean, I think Williamson is better thought of as governance cost economics or governance structure rather than sort of transactions costs per se. So I think we have to sort of artfully weave together various perspectives. As Jean says, there are property rights issues. There are also important issues, I think, around capabilities. I think these things all live somewhat happily together, but it is awfully confusing if one is not precise about the definitions that one uses. So whoever asked that question, I think, did put their finger on something that's important. And whenever we're using these ideas, we have to be quite specific about exactly what we mean when we say transaction costs, and which dimensions of transaction costs we're highlighting. And underneath transaction costs, of course, are usually bigger phenomena about governance and organization that need to be brought out as well.
Joanne, please.
Yeah, I would love to just jump in a little bit too, because so I think that to David's point, I think being specific is very important, or being precise when it comes to defining terms within a particular context, and really, kind of going back to explicating precisely what it is that you are trying to explain, and the terms, etc. To be honest, I don't see a whole lot of value in these debates about where, kind of claiming turf in some sense about, what different theories can or cannot do. I mean, it reminds me, Peter, you'll remember we were students together in Williamson's class, and in there, we talked a lot about property rights. We talked about information costs. So this was not about, and the sense was, it's not that is wrong and this is right. It's much more about within this particular context, or within this framework, this is how things are defined. And to go back to it in terms of this relationship between different theories, I think, the key issue is not what particular type of contracting hazard you're looking at, but rather defining what that contracting hazard is. And again, going back to the transaction as the unit of analysis, and this relentlessly comparative analytical approach. And I actually think that a lot of the more recent, really interesting recent developments within the kind of transaction cost domain is precisely looking more at these informal kind of arrangements, where for sure issues of power and quote unquote trust come in, and to what extent can you rely on promises made, etc. And so I don't think, it's not this idea that transaction cost explains everything, nor is it the idea that it should be kept out of some particular domain. It's like you use these ideas when they are useful, and the important thing is that you are very clear about your behavioral assumptions. You are very clear about your definition of terms within the particular context that you're looking at. You are very specific about what is the institutional environment in which these kind of transactions are taking place. And you're very clear about what are the discrete forms that you are comparing under these conditions. And so I think, I'm less interested in debates about, is this transaction cost? Is it not? Is it this? Is it that? I'm much more interested in, how do we use these ideas in a disciplined way when we're faced with a new situation, thinking carefully about how does it apply in this particular context.
Very well said. Thank you. Let's move on to another topic. There's a really interesting question here about the utility of transaction cost economics for addressing the sort of grand challenges, not just commercial transactions and what multinationals are, how multinationals are organizing, but I'm referring to one of Jonathan's questions here, thinking about the social and the natural environment. Can TCE be fruitfully applied to studying NGOs and other kinds of government and governmental organizations? Can it address poverty alleviation and inequality and disease and other kinds of these sort of big picture issues? Anybody have any thoughts on what transaction cost theorizing can do for us to understand these issues? Alain.
Yes, I would be happy to say a few words about this, because I actually was engaged in a debate with Jean Bodwin and Peter Berkeley a number of years ago on this particular issue in kind of a journal that is less known outside of international business. It's Multinational Business Review. And so Berkeley and Bodwin were defending the perspective that transaction costs thinking and internalization theory could be readily applied to basically study how firms are or should be creating public goods. And at that point, I was very negatively inclined. I said, no, no, no. So transaction cost theory, internalization theory, it's all about efficiency. So in other words, we should not confuse efficiency with distribution. Distributional issues are completely separate. But I must say that in the last few years, I have really changed my mind on this because, of course, we see increasingly that firms need this license to operate sustainably in the long run. And even in rule of law countries, highly developed countries, the question is, how do we get this license to operate sustainably? I mean, you just have to look in the United States at some cities where basically franchises of very large companies are burning, like Starbucks cafes, for example, and you realize that this is now becoming an intricate part of business. And so my point is that I think purchasing or negotiating the license to operate sustainably is becoming a production factor, just like labor or just like capital or just like, you know, some other inputs. And so it becomes part of the efficiency picture. I think that that is one of the great insights, if you want, that we get from what is presently going on in many parts of the world, whether it's the United States or when you think about, for example, all the difficulties that firms have to develop infrastructure in Northwestern Europe, where basically there is, of course, the not in my backyard syndrome, but also kind of not in anyone's backyard syndrome, where ultimately you have to negotiate with a large number of stakeholders to be able to operate sustainably. So the answer to me is yes.
Can I say
Anyone else
something?
want to jump in? Yeah, Jean-Francois, please.
So if you think of the origin, I mean, the problem of externalities, both positive and negative externalities, which means pollution, is really at the center. I mean, one of the major issues that transaction cost theory can handle and has handled. And there is two parts to it. One is the issue of why do we have externalities, which has to do with the failure of markets. And then there is this other part in which Williamson also dealt with, which is how do you remedy this? And he has some work on regulation capture, the fundamental transformation in regulation, which I think is very relevant to those issues of major issues of how do you avoid firms and individuals destroying the planet. So I think it is very much at the core of transaction cost theory.
And let me add to that. I mean, transaction cost theory a la Williamson kind of began early on by looking at regulation. I mean, Oliver's paper, Franchise Bidding for Natural Monopolies, was about, you know, whether you could use franchise bidding or whether you needed regulation for TV franchises, cable TV franchises, looking here at the city of Oakland. And that paper really sort of highlighted when you can rely on competition and when you can't to get broader social purposes done. So I think there is a lot of relevance in what Williamson has done around how do you put together what markets can do and when do you need to regulate and when don't you need to regulate. So I would agree that there's a lot there, but it requires reading beyond his contributions in international business. He did a lot of work on public economics, and the whole field, as Peter Klein knows, of institutional economics is really looking at many of these other broader issues.
Okay, terrific. Let me turn back to Alain for a moment, because there's a question that is very specific to your analysis and your remarks as well about value creation. The question asks, are cost minimization and value creation, do they occur along the same scale? You suggest that conceptually they're very different. Could you elaborate on how thinking about transaction costs can assist our understanding not only of cost minimization, but also of value creation?
Yes, let me perhaps just start by mentioning, of course, the famous work of Kogut and Zander on the knowledge-based view of the firm, which is a theory that argues, you know, kind of forget about opportunism. It's all about bounded rationality. And why do firms exist is because firms are better at transferring knowledge across borders, of course, especially multinational enterprises, And through being better at transferring knowledge across borders, they thereby create value. But and now I come to an answer to your question. The reality, of course, is that that whole knowledge-based view of the firm and the multinational enterprise is half true, but it's also perhaps half wrong in the sense that it's not sufficiently qualified in which particular cases multinational enterprises are going to be the best vehicle to transfer knowledge across borders, thereby creating value. So I think that we come back always to these micro foundations. So when you think about reducing problems of bounded rationality and anticipating problems of reliability or even in a narrow sense opportunism, it is of course always in mind with the idea in mind, how are these transactions going to unfold over time? That is the whole issue of exposed governance. So I think that, and I come back to what David Teece was saying, I think when you look at the ex-ante picture, yes, indeed, you can look at negotiation costs. You can actually kind of try to put a monetary figure on that. But when you think more about exposed governance and the unfolding of transactions, what does that mean? When unfolding of transactions means here is actually production going on in a foreign subsidiary, or here is innovation going on in a foreign R&D lab. And it's ultimately all about creating value rather than measuring transaction costs in a narrow sense. And I should mention that a number of people, of course, have studied this in review papers, but actually there are very few papers that measure transaction costs in a strict sense. Most papers that nowadays use transaction cost economics in strategy and international business kind of make that leap towards value creation. Now, whether the mechanisms then, in terms of how governance translates into value creation and value capture, how these mechanisms work exactly, I do agree that many papers are somewhat kind of missing on those mechanisms. But I think that many scholars who understand the theory will use, I think, for example, in the field of international business, I think about my senior editor, Gyps Yadong Luo, much of his work, kind of in a sense informed by transaction cost theory, but it's always about how ultimately value is being created in a real world multinational setting.
Yes, and let me just say, Peter, one thing about Williamson and his great emphasis on safeguards, it was always about, okay, there's got some assets here, let's protect them to make sure that value is not extracted in the wrong manner. I sometimes say that Williamson talked a lot more about opportunism than he did about opportunity. So there's not much about entrepreneurship in Williamson. There's less about how value gets created than about, the governance structures you need to protect assets. So he does come up a bit short, I think, with respect to value creation, but unless you've got the right governance structures, you never get the opportunity to create. But he would, 90% of what he was writing about was protecting sunk investments or organizing to make sure you could afford to make those investments. And he was the first one to admit that innovation really isn't center stage in his analytical framework, and that he was always very welcoming and receptive and encouraging of those people that sort of tried to take on issues about value creation and innovation.
Yeah, can I just add a little bit to Peter? Because I think that to David's point, I think this is where some of the work on alliances is really helpful in thinking about value creation and appropriation, if you like. Because to build on your point, David, I think, yes, Williamson talked a lot about safeguards and kind of protecting assets, but another spin on that was something that he would say, and that I must say is the way that I think of it to a large extent, is what safeguarding is really about infusing a relationship with confidence, right? And infusing a relationship with confidence so that you create the environment where both parties feel confident to invest. So, with an alliance, it's pretty clear that there's who do you partner with? So you want those complementary capabilities, There's how do you organize, and obviously for value creation, in many ways you want it to be as close as possible and as fluid and kind of like cooperative within the organization itself. And then where transaction cost comes in is the question that you ask is how do you embed that in a governance structure which gives both parties the confidence to come together and bring their, if you like, their best game to create value. And so while a lot of people looking at transaction cost economics focus on the opportunism and on kind of the protection, I think an equally important perspective is, if you take it from the point of view, for instance, of one alliance partner, is not just how do I protect my own assets, but how do I help to put in place safeguards which creates sufficient confidence for my partner that they will then bring that investment and they will contribute. So as an alliance partner or as any transactor, I should be just as concerned about the confidence that my trading partner has in this relationship as the confidence that I can have in it. And that's certainly something that I take to MBA students when I'm teaching this, is that a lot of MBA students go into these things, I'm overgeneralizing, but really kind of going into things like alliances with how can we grab the biggest value that we possibly can get out of this, or they'll talk about vertical integration decisions, oh, if we do this, we can kind of like thin the margins of our suppliers and etc. And so it's like, I think a really important perspective from transaction cost economics is no, if you want to create value in this relationship, you have to infuse it with confidence so that both parties are bringing their best game.
Jean-Francois, I want to give you the last word on this.
Okay, so transaction cost theory is really about value creation in my view, but value creation requires some institutions. So if you look, for example, at vertical integration in the aluminum industry, which I did some study on, what I found looking at comparison between integrated plants, that is alumina refineries, for example, owned in common with bauxite mines, versus the Japanese alumina refineries, which was relying on long-term contracts. The Japanese built, if you look at alumina refining, there is a different process for trihydrates and monohydrate bauxite. The Japanese had to build plants which actually could take both types of bauxites, and their costs were much higher than the integrated refineries that only rely on one type of bauxite. So the efficiency of the interaction was much greater when it was vertically integrated than when it was not. So that's actually value creation. So even in a very narrow context of vertical integration in mineral industries, you can see that transaction costs actually explain conditions under which more value can be created.
Well, thank you very much for that. Folks, I'm afraid we're running up against our time constraints. So let me quickly thank all of the panelists once again for very insightful remarks. Also to those of you who asked questions, thank you for those questions. And I apologize if we did not have time to get to your specific question, but perhaps one or more of the panelists would be happy to follow up with you privately by email. So I'm going to turn it back over to Tim now for some closing remarks.
Yes, thank you, Peter. What I'd like to do is to kind of bring Oliver in as a person. We've talked a lot about his theories, and Joanne talked a bit about his role as a PhD student. I met Oliver more than 30 years ago now, and under kind of really odd circumstances. I was a junior faculty member sitting in my office at UCLA, and the phone rings. And I answer it, and he says, this is Oliver Williamson. Am I speaking to Timothy DeVinny? And I said, yes. And he said, oh, look, I was talking to a colleague of mine at Berkeley, and he said he thought you would be an interesting person to have in my PhD seminar. And I said, really? And he said, yeah. I said, I looked at some of your stuff, and if you come up and just kind of give a talk on this and spend a day, maybe 2 days up here, we can have a chat. Just completely out of blue. I knew his reputation, read all the stuff, sort of kind of looking at. So I rock up at Berkeley, and I think Joanne and Peter will kind of know this. And I meet with them and talk with them, and he gives a seminar. And as the seminar is over, several of the graduate students walk up to me and hand me reviews of my paper. And I'm looking at this and saying, what is this? And he says, oh, I'm part of their job is to write a review. So they wrote a review of my paper. And he says, oh, look, don't worry. Everybody gets a revise and resubmit. and I bust out laughing and sort of said, boy, I wish all journal editors were quite so kind, until I read the reviews, of course, which were not kind at all. But I spent more than a day. Yeah, I spent more than a day, right, talking to him. And this was about the time he wrote his paper on trust in Journal of Law and Economics. And anybody who's read that paper, which is a marvelous paper because it's just a bunch of stories, really, right? He goes through a lot of these logical scenarios and asks these questions. And I'm saying, yeah, but there isn't any real kind of structured theory there. And I said, there are lots of holes in this. And he said, well, okay, just prove me wrong. So I spent 6 years trying to prove him wrong. And ultimately, there was a paper that came out in 1999, I think, where I proved him right. So when I finally sent him the paper, he said, what took you so long? And I bust out laughing, but one of the things that you really recognize is Oliver Williamson almost always wrote single authored papers. But he gave all of this knowledge and all of this insight and all of this capability, but he didn't internalize it in terms of his own publications. In other words, he let the externalities exist. He kind of gifted them to the society at large, to the community at large, right? And I always found that to be not only very old school, but also very, very inspiring in the sense that he didn't seem to care in many ways who got the credit for all this other stuff. He knew who his grandchildren were. He knew who his children were. He knew he was having influence. He didn't necessarily have to claim it for himself, which I always find to be unbelievably noble. And I think that that's an inspiration. Not all the theory, all the discussion, everything else. I put kind of him and Ronald Coase in exactly the same kind of pantheon associated with that. Having known both of them, Coase initially from my time in Chicago. They're truly unique individuals in many regards in terms of how they did that. So I think that there's a lot to learn, not only from his theories, but also from him as an individual. So kind of my final comments are really related to that. What I'd like to do, just as a way of kind of summarizing all of this, is to just begin by thanking all of the speakers and to thank Alain, Jean-Francois, David, and Joanne for the commentaries and all of the information. Peter Klein, of course, for moderating it so effectively. Again, we always have to thank Tunga Kaik and Renfei Gao for setting these things up and making them work really, really well. I think we've really started to build a real tradition around these webinars. What I'd like to do then is close and remind people that we will be continuing these. We have another webinar set up on the 27th of August. This says tentative, but it will occur on that date, it appears, on why do M&Es love mega cities. Saria Lunden, who's the editor of Journal of International Business Policy, will moderate. The speakers will be Peng Fei Li, Christine Coate, and Ram Mudambi. And you can obviously register for that in the same place. And we will have a whole series of new webinars from September onwards. So look out for the announcements. So with that, I'd like to thank all the speakers. I'd like to thank everybody who's been asking questions and been involved. I think we can all build on the tradition of scholars like Oliver Williamson. And I think it's important to kind of take stock of individuals who've had such huge impact on people intellectually as well as personally. So with that, I'd like to close the webinar and say thank you to everybody. So thank you.
Thank you, Timothy.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.